The broadcast of the regular meeting of the Committee of the Whole will now begin.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeremiah Ellison, and I'm the chair of the Committee of the Whole, and I'm going to call to order our regular. I'd like to note for the record, this meeting has remote participation by council members and city staff as authorized under the Minnesota Open Meeting Law, Section 13D.021, due to the declared state of local public health emergency. I will also note that the city will be recording and posting this meeting to the city's website and YouTube channel as a means of increasing public access and transparency. This meeting is public and subject to the Minnesota Open Meeting Law. At this time, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll to verify the presence of a quorum.
Councilmember Reich.
Here.
Councilmember Gordon.
Here.
Councilmember Fletcher.
Here.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Present.
Councilmember Osmond.
Here.
Councilmember Goodman.
Present.
Councilmember Cano. Councilmember Bender.
Here.
Councilmember Reich. Oh, excuse me, I have that twice.
I'm here
Councilmember
twice.
Schrader.
Councilmember Schrader here.
Thank you. Councilmember Johnson.
Here.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Present.
Councilmember Cano. Vice Chair Jenkins.
Present.
And Chair Ellison.
Present.
That's 12 members present.
There is a quorum. We have two items on today's agenda in addition to the committee reports. I am going to be taking those items up in reverse order. Both are extremely important, but our second item is the Neighborhoods 2020 program and neighborhood organizations funding updates. And because it is such a high profile agenda item and it's very forward facing, and I understand that some council members who might want to be a part of the conversation may have limited time, I'm going to ask that we take up item 2 first and then the second presentation, item 1. And so with that, item 2 on our agenda is an update on the Neighborhoods 2020 program. I believe that report will be introduced by David Rubador, Director of Neighborhood and Community Relations. Mr. Rubador.
Thank you, Chair Ellison. Good morning, council members. My name is David Rubador. I'm the Director of the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department with the City of Minneapolis. So today I'm going to be presenting an update on the implementation of the Neighborhoods 2020 program, as well as reporting back to the council on the staff directive that was passed during the budget process to have NCR work with the Finance and Property Services Department on options for increasing funding to neighborhood organizations by $3 million a year annually. In this presentation today, I'm joined by Amelia Kruver, Director of the city's budget director, as well as Steve Gallagher, our policy specialist with NCR. Next slide. Today's action is a receive and file on both of those items, the update on the Neighborhoods 2020 implementation, and then the options to increase funding for neighborhood organizations. So this will be a receive and file action today. Next slide. I want to start off with just reminding the council and the community that the Neighborhoods 2020 work has really been guided by and developed by the Neighborhoods 2020 Steering Committee. The committee has really overseen the development of this program as well as the implementation of it thus far. It's been I just always wanted to take the opportunity to say that this process of having this type of committee structure in place has been extremely helpful for staff in the development of this program, and I think there's been a tremendous value added. Representation on the Neighborhoods 2020 committee includes council members. So we have Council Member Cunningham serving as our chair, We have Council Vice President and Council Member Johnson serving as well. Representation from the Finance Department, City Coordinator, Mayor's Office, as well as the City Attorney's Office. And then we do have C. Terrence Anderson from the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs with the University of Minnesota, in addition to NCR staff. Next slide. So today I'm going to talk about the status of the program implementation, and then also talk about some modifications we are making to the Neighborhoods 2020 programs implementation. These modifications are intended to recognize the tremendous demands currently being addressed by our city and our neighborhood partners. As you may recall, last year, we delayed the adoption of the entire program until later in the year, as our city was faced with many stresses and unique challenges, everything from the onset of COVID to the killing of George Floyd and the civil unrest. Neighborhood organizations had asked us to give them a little bit more time to be able to deal with those very important issues on the local level, while still having time to actually review the program in detail and be able to comment on it appropriately. And so we adopted the program at the end of the year during the budget process. This year, we're still faced with some of those challenges. Our neighborhood organizations continue to work on COVID, which is still very much affecting our community. And now with the trial of Derek Chauvin underway, our neighborhood organizations have been great partners in working with the city on many different levels of getting information out and working with their community members to deal with these additional stressors. So for that reason, we've made some modifications to the implementation of this program while still trying to advance the core aspects of it. Next slide, please. So just as a reminder, the Neighborhoods 2020 program is really a set of 4 different programs. The first of which is the Neighborhood Network Fund, which is the base level funding and the fund that's intended to support a citywide network of neighborhood organizations. The second fund is called the Equitable Engagement Fund, and that fund is to support and provide resources for neighborhoods to focus in on and engage historically underengaged communities. The third fund is the Partnership Fund, which is intended to incentivize partnerships between community-based organizations and our neighborhood organizations. And the fourth fund is the Collaboration and Shared Resources Fund, which is intended to provide resources for neighborhoods that are looking at cost sharing models or resource sharing models, or looking at any types of mergers or ways of working better together. In consultation with the Neighborhoods 2020 Steering Committee, we've decided to move forward with the Partnership Fund and the Collaboration and Shared Resources Fund as originally planned. We know that there are a number of neighborhoods and community-based organizations that have already started working together and have an intention of applying for these funds. We also know that there are a number of neighborhoods that are looking at the Shared Resources Fund and are looking to move forward and exploring various models of cost sharing and other ways of working together. So for that reason, we're going forward with those as planned. The applications for these programs are actually online as of today on the NCR website, and they will be due on July 1st as originally planned. The other 2 funds, the Neighborhood Network Fund and the Equitable Engagement Fund, are neighborhood specific, and we're going to extend their deadline to January 1st of 2022. This will give neighborhoods more time to focus in on their applications and make any changes that they need in order to apply for those programs, while at the same time continuing to deal with those immediate concerns that I talked about that neighborhoods are dealing with today. To make this simple and to effectuate this, what we're going to do is we're simply going to extend the existing CPP contracts through the end of this year, and we will be adding the allocations that were set aside for the Neighborhood Network Fund and the Equitable Engagement Fund and roll that into the CPP program. So bottom line is basically the funding that neighborhoods were already that are allocated through these programs will be rolled into CPP. There will be no change to what was proposed to be funded for neighborhood organizations this year. There will be no changes to the program budget overall. So the program budget remains the same. We are going to require that neighborhoods submit an equitable engagement plan for this extension because we do want to continue to move forward with increasing the diversity and representation within organizations. And for that, we put together a template, which is also online today for neighborhoods to look at and to use when we're moving forward with effectuating the contract extension. So I'm just going to reiterate just to make sure that it's clear and so that the public, it's clear for the public and community members to understand the partnership fund and the collaboration and shared resources fund will go forward as planned. Applications are open as of today and they will be due on July 1st. The Neighborhood Network Fund and the Equitable Engagement Fund, the deadline will be extended to January 1st of 2022. CPP contracts will be extended to cover the 6-month period. Neighborhoods have 6 more months to complete those applications, but we are going to require that an equitable engagement plan be submitted so we continue to move forward with the goals of the program. With that, I'm ready to move into the second part of the presentation, but I'll pause here for a minute to defer to the chair if he wants to stop at this point or move forward.
I'm not seeing any questions from colleagues, so I think we can proceed forward.
Right. So the second part of the presentation is on options, is referring back to the staff directive that was passed in the budget process last year, and that's around options for expanding ongoing funding for neighborhood organizations by $3 million. So NCR has been working with the finance department on various options. We did present these to the steering committee for their be reviewed. I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Director Kruver to present these options, and then I'll be available at the end of the presentation for any questions.
Great, thank you, Director Rubidor. So if you want to go to the next slide, perfect, thank you. So the options that we are going to discuss today fall into 2 main categories. The first, which considers ongoing funding, uses property tax levy as its primary source. The second option we're going to talk about is how we can maybe creatively use some one-time dollars to extend this increase for several years while other options are considered. So the first slide talks a little bit about property tax levy, and I'll say as a background, lots of neighborhood work was primarily funded by the consolidated TIF district, transfers in from that fund. And that went away last year. And so this year we are operating entirely off of dollars that remain in that fund, but there's no new revenues coming in. So next year, there's about $3 million remaining from the consolidated TIF district that will be applied towards the base spending for neighborhoods. And then in 2023, will be entirely on the general fund, the base amount for neighborhood spending. So just as a little background sort of for how the work is funded now and how that will be changing in the next 2 years. So thinking about an additional $3 million amount, which is what the staff direction asked for, the general fund levy could be utilized. It could be utilized in the first year, which would result in about a 0.8% increase on the tax levy, or a phased-in approach could be used. And I put a table on this slide here to kind of illustrate how if an additional one-time source were identified, that could be used to phase in the $3 million and increase the tax levy gradually. So you'll see in the top line that shows the amount per year that we would need a one-time source of non-general fund dollars, and then the incremental increase in the levy. And you'll see the bottom line shows you the percentage increase in the property tax levy that would be required to do this kind of phased-in approach through 2026. So this approach would require about $7.5 million in other resources in order to make that increase on the levy a little bit more gradual. And we'll talk a little bit more about potential sources for that one time on the next slide. So we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So this is the similar kind of proposal, just with a shorter timeline. So if we were to try and phase in to move entirely onto the general fund levy, move this $3 million increase, I should say, This is what it would look like. And the reason I offer this, you may see that the timeline here is 2022 through 2024. The federal funds that will be coming to the city as a part of the American Rescue Plan Act have that timeline. I'll say again, I'm kind of a broken record for those of you I've spoken to about this. We don't know the specifics on the requirements around that funding yet, but I wanted to mock up an example in case this is an appropriate use and there's interest in that. So in this scenario, which is a shorter timeline to be moving entirely onto the property tax levy, about $5.5 million would be needed in a one-time source to be able to make this increase on the property tax levy more gradual, as you can see in the bottom line in that table. So for these two scenarios, they both require some one-time sources of funds as well as the levy. Options for that funding are, as I mentioned, potentially federal funds, depending on what the Treasury guidance, the final guidance is, and what decisions are made by the city around using those dollars. Another option would be the unobligated fund balance NRP funds. And there are some constraints on those dollars, but it's something that we should think about and could explore. So I'll go to the next slide just to wrap up. The other option, if the property tax levy is not a desirable route to go, would be potentially tapping into some of this unobligated fund balance in the NRP fund. Earlier estimates when discussing with Director Rubador and others are that there's about $15 million that could be used to increase funding by $3 million each year. And so this would essentially allow for that increased amount of spending through 2026. At that point, decisions would need to be made about either scaling down the amount of money going out through this mechanism or finding another ongoing source. And one thing that could happen in that timeline is more legislative options could be pursued. A lot of potential sources of revenue around things like TIF districts or other forms of revenue would need to go through the state legislature. So if that's something that is of interest, this might be a way to sort of provide bridge funding until a solution like that is found. All right. So I think that wraps it up. And Director Rubador, if you want to talk a little bit more about constraints on those NRP dollars or legislative solutions, I think that'd be great.
Sure. Well, Chair Ellison, I'll go ahead and jump into that. So as Director Kruger was saying, the notion that we talked about was ramping up a levy over a period of time and really, in essence, trying to kind of phase that in so the impact of that is not as great on our property taxes. So we were trying to look at ways we can kind of, and I like the term bridge funds, in order to kind of bridge that gap as we ramp up. So one of the options that we talked about, or two of the options that we talked about, one is using the unspent, uncontracted NRP fund balance. I'm going to just clarify, I want to use the term unobligated. These funds are obligated to specific neighborhood organizations or neighborhoods across the city. And so, but they're unspent and they're uncontracted, which means they're not actually dedicated, moving out and specifically basically effectuated to move out into the community yet. And there's about $60 million left on that fund balance. Moving any of those funds is going, none of these, well, I'll just be really clear, none of these options are like totally painless. So I just want to be clear about that. But we're trying to be creative here and just looking at all options and putting them on the table. But moving those funds around in order to create bridge funds basically would have implications for specific neighborhoods. And that would be some of the neighborhoods have a significant amount of money in that category and some have none. And so if we would have to look at some way to try to mitigate the impact on individual neighborhoods if we were to do that. One of the notions that we talked about is if we're ramping up a property tax levy over time in order to get to a benchmark, whether that would be more kind of palatable for neighborhood organizations to contribute into this fund in order to create that bridge. So that is just one thing to consider. It does have different impacts on different neighborhoods, and it varies a lot across the city. The second piece is we also talked about a legislative solution, which is the notion of going back to the legislature to see if we can reestablish either bring back an existing TIF, the previous consolidated TIF, or if there's an option to create a new one, what that would look like. That will take time as well and would require some kind of bridge before that would actually be implemented. So, realistically, it's probably a couple years before something like that would come into play as well. That in and of itself, as I know many of you have worked with the that process, has its challenges as well. And so none of these are like an easy fix. All of them have various pros and cons to them. And I guess we're both Director Kruger and I are available to talk about what those are. And I'll just stop at this point and just hand it back to the chair for any questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got two folks in the queue. Councilmember Palmisano wrote her question, but I'll give her an opportunity to ask it out loud.
Thank you, Chair Ellison. I think he just pretty much answered it. I think, Director Rubador, what you would say about my question, which was using the fund balance, can you go into the downsides of that? And what you've just said, if I could try to use that as the answer, is that this $15 million, or maybe closer to $16 million, is the current uncontracted fund balance that's in the NRP fund, right? And so the downsides of that is that this money was previously allocated to some neighborhood organizations, but they've not been able to actually put that under contract yet. Is that correct?
Chair Ellison, Councilmember Palmisano, that is absolutely correct. And in many cases, a lot of this money that's in that category is program income, where neighborhoods invested it at one point. It has been returned back to them through various loan programs, and now is available again. So it's not as if it's just been sitting there. NRP has a number of vehicles that allow money to recycle. So yes, and to your point, again, I just want to reiterate, some neighborhoods have quite a bit in this category and some have zero. And so any type of reallocation of this into a bridge fund would require some winners and losers.
So if I may, is one example of that the revolving loan program, right, for home improvement loans? And so the fund balance would be money that is maybe cycled one or more times, but that's a fund balance.
Chair Ellison and Councilmember Palmisano, so some programs recycle the money back into the same program. Some of them just receive it back into the NRP program overall. This would be the ones that receive it back that's not recycling it back into an existing program. So this is funds. So for example, if a neighborhood organization put in like a deferred loan for a housing development, and that housing development switches hands, it was sold, and that money gets paid back, or more often than not, it's more like an economic development project, that money comes back. That would then go into this pool of basically unspent, uncontracted funds, but it still is allocated to the neighborhood.
Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Palmisano. Before we jump to Council President Bender, I just want to state for the record that we have been joined by Councilmember Cano. Councilmember Bender.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I had a phone call come in at the very beginning of the presentation, so I apologize if I missed something and this is a repeat. So this is in response to a staff direction that was asking you to come back and provide this information, which is why you're here. I wondered if you could talk about on slide 5 the way that the funds would be allocated within the new structure which we adopted. And I saw that the race equity analysis that was provided along with this presentation really highlighted the Cura work and the guidelines that went into that new funding mechanism. So I can just ask that question, or if that's too redundant, I can follow up with a more specific question, or I can call you as well.
Chair Ellison and Council President Bender, I'll go ahead and respond to that. The staff direction did not provide any guidance or any direction around how those funds would actually be allocated back in, whether it would simply be put through the, the breakdown of the formula of how it gets split up between the various funds, or if it's like a fund specific direction. It did not have any guidance on that. It was really, the direction was very general, looking for up to $3 million annually for supporting neighborhood organizations.
And you're not making a specific recommendation today about how to use the funds within the new framework?
Chair Ellison and Council President Bender, you are correct. We are not making any recommendations. We're simply bringing back the options as directed for your consideration.
Thank you. And maybe just a quick comment. I mean, as I think about all that's happening in the city, I think, as you note in the presentation, our neighborhood organizations are stepping up in all kinds of ways that are well beyond what they were probably used to doing in the past, from organizing neighborhood safety networks to, being out in the neighborhoods last summer, out in the streets with people, and hosting forums. And so I totally acknowledge the ways that neighborhood organizations across the city are stepping up and may need more capacity. But I also know that, as we think about how we've prepared for the trial of Derek Chauvin and the gaps that are still there in the system, council members will remember that we were asked to vote on funding before we were able to get a presentation about the plan. It was Friday and then the following Monday, unfortunately, where we voted and then got a presentation. And so, one of the gaps that I see is that there's no funding for mental health support specifically as we go into this summer. We funded 6 organizations with that $1 million. That was for folks who are out in the streets. But there seems to be so much potential for neighborhood organizations and others who are digging into this work to really expand into some specific areas, that being one example. So I think with the information that I have, I would be more open to a approach that took a more directed look at what are some things that neighborhood organizations are likely already doing, but are really in alignment with what gaps we might see in community engagement or community support that are specific. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you for the work, and I'm happy to follow up too, because I did miss the very beginning of this. Thanks.
Thank you, Council President. Were there any other questions? And is that the end of your presentation, Director Rubidor?
Chair Ellison, that is the end of the presentation. Yes, thank you.
I couldn't remember who the authors of the staff direction were off the top of my head, but if I want to give a moment to see if they had any questions, any input. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the details being shared here. It is very helpful when we're talking about increasing funding in a specific area like this, and talking about and considering a substantial amount, that we have this kind of detail, and that we're also thinking in different ways and understanding the levers as well, right? Because it's not, obviously there is the opportunity of a one-time increase, which would have the 0.8% impact on the levy, but there are other options as well that are available, such as a phased-in approach, such as using these different fund balances. So I thought this was really helpful in that effort. And just thinking through next steps, for the public, I know that the mayor has sent out budget instructions to departments, and is really going to be ramping up on working on the 2022 budget proposal very quickly. That is due to the council no later than August 15th. And in that, I hope to see the mayor taking on this work and looking at how to increase funding for our neighborhood associations. And I hope that this effort will help guide that and look at different options that are available in those discussions. And then as well, I know staff are currently right now meeting and talking about and understanding and working to understand the American Rescue Plan Act and different opportunities there. I think that actually what Council President Bender said around very targeted ways as well to fill in gaps provides a real immediate opportunity through the work of neighborhood associations. I will say, and I know Director Rubidor, said that the staff direction did not contemplate how the money would be distributed. I will say, as an author, my intent has always been around making sure that if we're increasing the pool of funding, that it is still going through the racial equity formula. I think if we don't do that, then we risk really diluting the impact of that work. And so I'll throw that out there, but I do believe that the increase, if we're in the $3 million range, would increase the base funding to a level to really help meet the minimal needs of running an organization, and frankly, the expectations that we put on neighborhood associations, which there are many. And it is a challenge with the current base funding to do that work and really to do all of that work and engage thousands of community members. I don't think is really possible with the base funding that was originally contemplated with the overall pool. And so this really opens up that opportunity as we're thinking about this. So again, really appreciate the presentation today by staff. I know there'll be a lot more discussion after this, and working with colleagues and the mayor and trying to look at the overall funding and how we can better support all the work that's going on out there, all the good work that's going on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Johnson. Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to very briefly say thank you to Director Rubidor and Steve Gallagher for all of their hard work, and Amelia for all of their hard work related to Neighborhoods 2020, the funding aspect of it, the programmatic aspect of it, the policies. They have been working incredibly diligently, and I have been fortunate to have been the chair, to be the chair of the steering committee, and being able to see firsthand the amazing work and the due diligence. They are meeting weekly with neighborhood organizations. I mean, there is a lot of work that has been going into this. I am very grateful and impressed by that work, and so I just wanted to make sure to take a moment during this time to express my gratitude to the city staff who have put countless hours into this work. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Cunningham. All right, I don't see anyone else in queue. So thank you for the presentation. Seeing no further discussion, I'll direct the clerk to file that report. And now we will move on to item number 1, which is is a report on the process and purpose and the city's response to data practices requests. And I will invite City Clerk Casey Carl to give the presentation on that item.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chair and members of council. My name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as clerk of the city of Minneapolis. And today, as the chair indicated, I'm providing a report on the status of data practices, which is in response to a directive first adopted by the City Council February 6th of last year. That directive requires regular reports on the city's response to requests for government data. The first report was issued on March 5th of last year, just before the global pandemic caused by COVID-19. Obviously, just as Mr. Rubidor mentioned in his presentation, much has changed over the past year as the world has grappled with the pandemic. And here in Minneapolis and in our metro community, our state and nation, there also have been other issues that have further prevented our reporting on a regular basis on these issues as the city has adjusted to multiple priorities and urgent needs. So today's presentation is an attempt to level set from that prior directive and to address the impact of data practices during the first quarter of this year, 2021, and provide additional details to policymakers about the city's plans to improve our accessibility as an enterprise to make our data and information assets available to the public. Before I begin, I would like to take a chance to recognize the incredible work of my team, which is led by Assistant City Clerk Christian Rummelhoff, who's the director of our Information Governance Unit in the clerk's office, as well as our Data Practices Compliance official, Kristen Olson. The two of them and our team shepherd this work across the enterprise, which includes includes all 22 operating departments. The successes and the challenges that I'm going to be highlighting today in this report are really a reflection of their work, and I want to start off by stating how proud I am of their accomplishments. They are a small but very mighty team in terms of being champions for open access to government data, and they collaborate with all of our departments and our policymakers to ensure that the public has access to government data. So again, in terms of level setting, it's important for us to recognize the frameworks in which we operate. And this slide reflects both the legal framework as well as the policy and management framework that affect government data. While there are many laws and policies that do impact government data, in Minnesota, there are primarily 3 statutes that dictate how government information is made and managed. And just like these puzzle pieces that are shown on the slide, these laws work together to provide certain assurances that records are made and preserved to support accessibility to and accountability of government. Those 3 laws include the Official Records Act, which prescribes what records government must make and keep. So that essentially forms the why and the what of our legal framework. The Records Management Statute regulates how government records are to be maintained, managed, and disposed of across defined life cycles. So that's essentially the how and the when of our legal framework. And then there's the Government Data Practices Act, which classifies government data and also regulates who can access that government data and under what conditions. So that's essentially the who element of our legal framework, but it also, of course, does have additional details related to the what, the how, and the when. The primary focus of these reports is really on the last law that I mentioned, the Government Data Practices Act, which is one of the most complex and challenging laws in the state of Minnesota in terms of practical implementation and administration. And of course, being the largest municipal jurisdiction in the state, it has special challenges for the city of Minneapolis. In terms of the policy framework shown on the right side of this screen, we have the city's Information Governance, or IG, policy, which establishes the very broad operating controls across our enterprise in line with statutory requirements. And as you can see here, there are a few cross-cutting departments that provide responsibility for implementing those laws and ensuring compliance. But underneath that umbrella, it's really each of our operating departments that's responsible for implementing the laws, the policies, and the procedures to ensure that the city is in compliance with all of the laws that apply to us. So each department has an information governance, or IG, liaison, who is our key connection to the work in that department and our primary point of contact in terms of accessing government data and processing data requests. The city clerk has a central role to play as the city's designated responsible authority. The responsible authority is a mandated statutory role that is anticipated to provide a single point of public accountability for the implementation and enforcement of these laws. There is a responsible authority required for every jurisdiction. In theory, this law gives wide latitude and discretion to the responsible authority to ensure compliance with these laws. However, that latitude is based on resources and capacity. So in a small jurisdiction, it might be possible for the responsible authority to fulfill those expectations. However, in a large jurisdiction, the largest jurisdiction like Minneapolis, which is very large and complex and diffused, it is impossible for the responsible authority to fulfill those expectations. And to understand why that's true, consider that the Data Practices Act uniformly applies to all state executive agencies, all counties, all cities, all towns, all school districts, and all of our special units of government in Minnesota. That's literally thousands of entities that have different structures, different governing provisions, different operating needs, different functions, but they all have a responsible authority expected to cover these laws and ensure compliance. The city of Minneapolis does meet our obligations, but we do it in a little bit different way. We hold our departments generally responsible for the implementation and compliance, and then a few of our central offices are the ones that provide oversight, monitoring, and enforcement. That includes, of course, the Office of City Clerk, the Office of City Attorney, the Human Resources Department, and especially our city's Information Technology Department, and within that department, especially our Chief Information Security Officer and our Chief Data Officer. Our collaboration in the clerk's office with all of our operating departments is critical in order to fulfill our responsibilities and duties under the law. But our partnership with the IT department is perhaps most important in that regard. Over the past few years working with IT, our data access team has developed a working model that we believe will help us as a city enterprise anticipate, address, and answer data requests in a more timely, effective, and efficient manner. And so on this next slide, you can see that we have the basic operating principles shown here for you that identify how we're making government data accessible. In Minneapolis, data is either ready or it is requestable. We endeavor to keep data at the ready. This means making information classified as public data immediately available and accessible, primarily through one or more of the city's online platforms. This includes our data source and our open data portal. In addition to those primary data platforms, we also connect to other major systems and sources of public data. For example, here we've shown the city's legislative information management system, and we also have a variety of websites that include what we call counter documents or counter docs. These provide quick access to the most frequently requested data by department. And as we process data requests, we try to note trends in order to identify additional data or data sets that might be added to our online data platforms. And of course, we always welcome suggestions from our departments and our policymakers and even the public. Our ideal is to make public data easily and readily available through these portals and these platforms if and whenever possible. This approach does take time, but this report isn't really focused on our successes and challenges that we have as a city in this regard. It is another story, and it's included in the annual State of Data report, primarily led by the IT department with the clerk's input. That regular report also was stalled this past year because of COVID, and it needs to be restarted as well. Of course, if data is not immediately ready and available, then it can be requested, as I indicated and is shown on this slide, which is pursuant to state law. This process is reflected in the green icons on the slide, and the work is primarily led by our clerk's office information governance team. Here you can see that the major components of this work is broken down into receive, retrieve, review, and release. Requests for government data are streamlined through our Open City, which is the city's online request portal, and that can be accessed from our website. The address is shown at the very bottom of this slide, minneapolismn.gov/requestdata. Individuals can submit their requests using that system, or they can contact 311 for help in submitting a data request. The system allows both requesters and our data access team to monitor the status of each request in real time as it moves through the system and is ultimately released. Between the proactive work that we do to make sure that government data is ready and the work we do every day responding to requestable data, we also then seek to reuse, shown in gray here, that data that has broad applicability or interest to the community. So this then informs the back end of our work, primarily working with IT, but all departments, to make data proactively ready by reusing work we've already done through the request process and streamlining it through into the ready portion, putting it on our data platform. So this is an iterative process of ready, request, and reuse, and it underpins all of our work to make city data more available to the public. I noted earlier that the council previously had directed staff to make regular reports on the status of data requests. Those reports are intended to provide a snapshot about the activity of a certain given reporting period. So we begin today by sharing details about the first quarter of 2021, the current year. So that would include data requests that were received and processed January, February, and March. As this slide indicates, we started the year with a total of 222 open requests that carried over from 2020. And to that, then during the first 3 months of this year, we added an additional 486 new data requests. That resulted in a total of 708 requests that we tracked and processed in the first quarter of this year. And of that total number of requests, the total volume, the team was successful in closing 520 requests. That equals about 73% of all of the requests covering just those first 3 months, just shy of 3/4 of the total data requests logged during the first 3 months of 2021. That included, as I mentioned, a very sizable chunk of requests that carried forward from 2020, but it does leave about 188 requests, which is about 1/4 of the total volume left, which will have to move into the second quarter of this year to be processed and handled. So these are just raw numbers that address quantity. There are, of course, many other factors and variables that can and do address our ability to fully understand the impact of data requests on the city enterprise. For example, requests by type, requests by department, length of time requests have been open. So I'm going to review some of that specific evaluation of this same data in a few slides, but what I'd like to do for now is expand our focus because it has been quite some while since we've talked about this. And I'd like to show you some trends over the last several years that show data practices as we've been handling them. So we'll move to the next slide. So this slide provides a lot of information in a single chart. It's complicated. Let me walk you through it. I'm going to start by moving our attention to the bottom of the slide. And here you can see we provided high-level results covering a 4-year period, 2017 through 2020, all data across all 4 of those years. And as you can see, the number of requests carried forward from one year to the next in that 4-year period has continued to increase, although we do see a slight tapering between 2019 and 2020. The total number of cases here jumped between 2018 and 2019 pretty significantly, but the number of new requests as well as the overall volume of requests, we're able to see that those are trending upward across that period. You can see also there has been a steady increase in the volume of requests just generally, not just carrying over from year to year, but an increase in new cases opened each year. The chart in the middle here, this slide shows all of the data requests received and resolved for both 2019 and 2020. So this is a 2-year snapshot of data practice requests across the entire enterprise, and it shows our performance as a city enterprise in handling those requests for government data. If you start at the 0 point in the middle of the chart, you see the blue bars that extend upward into the positive range. Those reflect the number of new data requests we've received and logged each month. The green bars that extend downward into the negative space on the chart reflect the number of requests closed each month. There's a little bit of a discrepancy between that. The blue bars only show new requests per month, not the carryover. The green bars show the total number of cases resolved each month, whether they were opened that month or carried forward. So to make up for the difference, that carryover, you can see there is some gray shading behind the blue bars in the top part of the chart. That gray area reflects the carryover, or what we might consider the backlog, carried from month to month. As you can see, the trends clearly show that we almost always carry some level of backlog with us month to month, although there are some periods when the outstanding number of requests becomes more significant. You can see this, for example, between October of 2019 and January of 2020. And then thankfully, there are also periods where we've been more successful at resolving the backlog of data requests. And so the gray area is reduced. And you can see an example of that between March and April of 2020, last year. This orange line that is in the middle of the chart is, for me, a very important element here, maybe the most important. This is the trend line that shows the difference between the number of new requests received per month and the overall number of requests resolved and closed. And the key thing for me, not being a data scientist, is that there's sort of a shorthand here. If the orange line spends too much time or goes too high into that blue bar area, the gray bar area, we're carrying too much and the team is exceeding its capacity. The number of requests we get exceeds our capacity to process them in a timely manner. Where you see the orange line dip down in below the 0 line or into the green area, the team is operating at peak capacity at that point, and we're able to quickly receive, resolve, and process and release public data. So an example of this peak processing point is seen in the last 2 quarters of 2020. But if we look at the data on this chart, some trends do start to emerge for us. So first, 2020 was the first year in the period that we've covered here in which the number of data requests did not reflect significant growth from the prior year. In fact, the volume of our new requests in 2020 was slightly lower than the overall 4-year average shown at the bottom. The beginning of 2020 showed growth on par with our prior year-over-year average, but interestingly enough, in March of 2020, the total number of requests was flat, and then it reduced in April and May. And I think that might be reflective of the initial impact of our local, statewide, and national health emergencies, which were declared March 16th. So likely that the declaration of emergency had some impact there on our performance. Requests for data then picked up, as you can see, over the summer months last year, presumably in response to the death of Mr. Floyd in police custody in late May, and then the subsequent civil unrest that followed through the summer months. Interestingly enough, though, the latter part of the year fell to below average numbers in terms of our new data requests when compared to the prior year of 2019. So here again, as I've said, this analysis is based solely on quantity. It doesn't look at other factors. And so again, just to change the lens a little bit and dig deeper for context, I'm going to go into that in the next series of slides. So here we're looking at 2020 performance data, showing you another slice of that same data I just did, but now we're looking at tracking requests according to two other metrics. First, results upon closure is shown on the left, and then on the right side we have time to close. So starting with the chart on the left of this slide, which is titled Results Once Closed, let me explain what we're showing here. As you can see, the bulk of data requests were resolved with responsive data being provided, and that's shown in the line that's labeled complete response. That category accounts for about 75% of all of the total volume in 2020. That means we had a complete response for about 3 of every 4 requests that we received last year. Of course, even when a complete response is given, it may contain redactions. So complete response here doesn't talk about the full set. We are required under the law to protect not public data. So complete response means that we satisfied the request, whether or not redactions were required. The next biggest category here is the no data, third down on the chart. This affects about 1 in every 6 requests that we processed in 2020. This category includes those requests where the city does not have the data requested. An example of this would be we receive a lot of data that is not city data. One that comes to mind for me is we receive in my office data requests for marriage, birth, and death records. Those are not city records, and so we would not have responsive data to those requests. We would mark those as no data and refer the requester to the appropriate agency, usually Hennepin County or the state. But another example of the kinds of data requests that get marked no data here is when the city data does not exist, it never existed, or it no longer exists. An example of this kind is requests for camera data tied to accidents. And we're going to track this a little bit forward in some future slides. Many times there's no data because there's no camera, or the camera angle didn't capture the data of an accident that's requested, or because of very short retention periods, the camera data is no longer in our possession. But that's why it would be marked no data. Approximately 3% of all requests fall then into 2 other categories, partial response and canceled. Partial response is the category we use when some elements of the entire request are provided, but others are not. So this might be, for example, where certain data is protected under the law and we cannot release it, but other elements of the request are public data and we do release those. Canceled as a category reflects those requests that were dropped by the requester. So this happens especially once partial data is given out and the requester may say, that's enough, I don't need any more. And so we would cancel the rest of that request. Overall, I would say, looking at the chart, the city's performance in 2020 was good. We averaged a closure rate of about 78% for all of the requests, whether that was complete or partial responses that were provided to the requesters. And on the right side of this chart, what you can see here is the average time to close requests. And again, this is another important metric in terms of our performance as an enterprise. You can see here the majority of most of our requests in 2020 were closed within that 0 to 10-day period, either immediately by referring them to an online data source or within 10 days. In fact, almost half of all of the requests in 2020 were closed in 10 days. About 3/4 of our requests in 2020 were closed in about 30 days or less, and then slightly more than 10% of all requests took up to 60 days to close. There are, unfortunately, I hate to report this, a small number of requests that remained in our system for 60, 90, or more days. And as you can see from the blue bars on this chart, those requests that were open the longest number of days then carried over into January this year and were part of that 222 requests that we started this year with that I mentioned earlier. This chart also reflects, at least in part, the impact of staffing reductions that we experienced in mid-2020 when the team lost 2 of our contract workers and mandatory furloughs were imposed and impacted our capacity. Additionally, we had a spike in the number of complex requests that we're going to talk about in a bit, and that also increases the time required to close out cases, complexity of the request. Finally, as part of the 2020 budget revision, you'll know that responsibility for the review and redaction and release of data requests involving the police department was transferred to the clerk's office, and that included the transfer of 2 positions as well as a backlog of some significant requests. All of those factors impacted our team's ability to achieve a more consistent turnaround time on closing data requests. And of course, the kind of request, as I've hinted at many times, does impact our time to close and respond. Most requests that are closed within that 10-day period are smaller requests for readily available and very specific data identified by our requesters. So the backlog to fulfill the other requests are almost always what we would call complex requests. These are requests that involve multiple departments, multiple years, multiple keywords, and also that require significant intervention by our data access team in order to review and redact any not public data so that we can ensure compliance with the law that we are only releasing public data in response to requests. Sometimes those large requests can involve thousands of pages for a single request. So in some instances, it can take several days or even weeks just to determine the parameters for those requests so that we can start searching and then the process to review. We'll move to the next slide. Now that we've reviewed 2019 and 2020 in whole, this is the part of the report that's really focused on just the first 3 months of this year, showing the enterprise, the city enterprise performance across those same metrics that I've already reviewed for a 2-year period. So here again, we're really starting with quantity, but I wanted to draw your attention here. These next 2 slides are going to slice and dice that same data as I mentioned. And this first slide provides our performance data for those first 3 months of 2021. You can see the volume of requests this year started to be a bit slower than in 2020. But you can also see that each month is trending upward just a little bit. In fact, of the almost 500 new requests that we logged in the first quarter of 2021, nearly 44%, about half of the total volume, we received just in March, so in 1 month. For the first quarter, we received a total of 486 new requests. We were successful at reducing the year-end carryover from 2020. So that our backlog wasn't quite as great when we carried over, and we're able to reduce our backlog going into the second quarter as well. So that's showing positive work by the team. But again, in terms of asking why this difference, why the spikes, and why are we still carrying over, and especially that big gray chart that's showing significant backlog carrying month to month. In part, as I said, this reflects those staffing changes that I've already mentioned. In January last year, we had 3 full-time people, and we were able to leverage our operating budget to pay for 5 contractors. So we had up to 8 data analysts who were working full-time on this. And so our turnaround time was much faster. But starting in the second quarter of 2020, we started to lose our contract workers, and those losses continued through August, which you can track here. You can see that then that the team's capacity was reduced, and there was a corresponding increase, shown in gray here, in the backlog that is starting to carry over month to month and from 2020 into 2021. That gray area, as I said, reflects the open and unresolved data requests from the public that we have to carry forward, and it does have corresponding increases in time that it takes us to close out those requests, and it's primarily related to team capacity. In October, as I mentioned earlier, responsibility for police data review and redaction transferred to our office. It did carry 2 FTEs, but did carry a significant backlog of police data. So while the overall transfer of FTEs helped complement the team, the fact that there was so much work that came with it didn't really increase the team's capacity to solve the overall enterprise-wide response to data practices requests. We'll go to the next slide. Here again, I'm showing you some other lenses to look through. An important factor that impacts our effectiveness, of course, is type. And so volume being one factor, type has a significant role on how long it takes to close out requests. Here you can see we've typed things according to 3 colors, and I'll review that very briefly. The green represents what we call well-defined workflows. So every request is associated with a workflow. If it's in green, it means that we have identified and provided a very specific request process that includes an automated workflow, and it has some limited numbers of automated reporting tools within the departments. That helps us be able to expedite getting the request to the appropriate department It enables them to gather the data faster and return it to us. And because we've worked with departments, we've streamlined the process of eliminating the need for extensive review and redaction by human intervention. So we're able to release the data faster. A really good example here of a well-defined request process are our phase 1 property assessments. In this case, we've worked with departments, we've created a standardized and automated workflow, we have reporting tools in place, and because we've already removed the non-public data, we're able to close out and respond with data in 10 days or less. And so this is our goal is shown in green. The requests coded blue here have some definition to them. Unlike the green, they do have some level of automation and use technology as much as possible to leverage our response in faster times. But very often here, we do have to connect to the requesters at the front end to clarify the data they're really requesting. We have to work with data in the departments to identify which data is really responsive to the request. There's not as much automation, so it does take more time to manually move these requests through the process. So we would expect that those requests coded in the blue do take a little bit more time. And then the last category shown in orange here is what we call limited definition. This is the type of request where the requester may not really know what they're asking for, and so we have to spend a lot of upfront time before the request is even defined, helping them to refine and clarify what they're looking for. That can take days or weeks. Then once we get the search terms worked out and agreed to, we have to work with one or more departments to find out who might have responsive data to the type of request. Departments have to spend a lot of time pulling and culling through that data, getting it back to us. We have to spend a lot more time on the back end reviewing and redacting not public data before we can release. And there's very little opportunity for us to really leverage technology in these, because the truth of the matter is that most of these requests shown in orange require us to approach these with a custom tailored response. And so they are always going to take a longer time. But our goal at a high level, looking at these three colors, is we meet with our partners in IT and other departments on a regular basis, monthly. And we talk about how can we move more of the blue coded items into green? How can we review and identify trends in the types of data that are being requested frequently? How can we identify those high value sets of data? And then how can we move through technology to automate the process of proactive release into the green or faster timelines? To the extent we can, we also look at doing that with those types of data that are shown here in orange. And the good news is in that column that shows 2020, you can see that we've had an increase by 6% approximately of moving requests into this category, and we've had a decrease in the orange category. So we are making some forward momentum here. I'm happy to report on that progress by the team and to assure you that we constantly are evaluating how to do this. In essence, what we're trying to do here is to take non-standardized requests and make them more standardized. We'll move to the next slide. Here we're showing the status of closed requests for the first quarter. This also provides a comparison to the same activity levels from 2020. Helps us measure the outcomes in terms of our work. So again, I went through this with the 2020 and 2019 data. You can see the levels of our response in terms of complete response and partial response, and whether a request was denied or canceled. Overall, the data here shows that we're doing fairly well in comparison to the first quarter of 2020. Of course, we're only reporting on the first 3 months, so time will tell how our performance continues in the rest of this year, and we'll be delivering that in future reports. On this slide, we're providing a high-level summary of the average time to close the 520 requests that we were able to process in the first quarter, and then comparing that to the 2,000 requests that were closed in all of 2020. It takes a bit longer to close requests, obviously, but you can see our performance both in terms of the age of the request when closed and the time to close out these requests. And again, without looking specifically at data, the good news here is that the bulk of all of these requests are able to be solved within 0 to 10 days. We actually had a slight increase in the number of requests that we were able to close in that period of time. The chart on the right here shows the average of 188 requests were open on April 1st. Roughly 39% of those requests have been open for 30 days or longer. It's about 1 in 4 being resolved, and then for 60 or more days. It's a stark improvement from January 1 of this year, but again, as always, there's improvements that we can make. I'm going to move to the next slide because we do have 2 more slides to get through, and they're both complex. but they do tell a good story that I want to share both with policymakers and the public. So on this slide, what you can see is a high-level analysis of both the request types that we went through, as well as the average times to close. So we've compressed into one chart several of those prior slides we just went through. Again, it's a complex graph, but it gets to the impact of workflow on our ability to close out requests and respond with public data in a timely manner. Here, the red shading indicates older requests. So those have been in the system for a longer period of time. And so the shorthand I would offer here to policymakers and public is the less red is better, right? We want to see less red on this chart. From the perspective of our requesters, then, I would suggest that as they look at this chart, the more red, and especially the darker the red, the worse the city's performance. The darker the blue, the better the city's performance. Again, we've added this orange trend line here for you, and what that shows is the volume measured on the far right side of this scale. So you can see by looking at the orange line that there are a certain number of high volume data sets. This includes camera data, snow and ice data, and requests that tie into Minneapolis animal care and control. The majority of our data requests are still classified as general, and general requests require the most amount of manual intervention and workflow processing. It requires more of our analysts to manually move these requests through the process without automation. So those are always going to take a longer time. It makes sense that there's a higher level of pink and ultimately red shown on that area. But we are using this area. This is an opportunity for us to leverage technology as and when we identify trends. You can see there is a lot of red on this chart. And more red would be expected for requests that are not well defined. We went through that process of defining the workflows. For example, one of the ones I'll call out here is called rolling production. This is almost entirely red, and it makes sense, even though I already said the more red is not good. But rolling production is really a way we use to take huge requests for data and break those down into smaller chunks so that at least we're getting out to requesters some data as much as possible, even as we continue to process the large volume of their work. So on the downside, this approach means that some of those requests remain in our queue a little bit longer. For context, this week, the team has 25 open rolling productions in our system, and it includes more than 52,000 documents that we have to review. So rolling production is always going to be a difficult one for us to handle, but the process of using rolling production allows us, instead of holding all the data, which would shut down our entire city system, we're able to get out chunks of data to requesters a little bit more timely. Another category here that tends to require longer processing time are email polls. These also show more red on the chart, and for many of the same reasons. Email is a quick production of data, and so scanning through thousands of emails in order to respond to data requests does take more time. I mentioned a little while ago, camera data is interesting. It's one of those where we often have to provide partial data or no data, and as you can see on here, it's one of our most requested data types. But based on applicable statutes that talk about retention periods and who can access it, sometimes we have quick answers, and other times there's just longer waiting times involved. In general, video is one of our most burdensome mediums in which to work. It's more complicated to review, and it's especially more complicated to redact when we're required to. So we would expect that camera data requests will trend higher in terms of timelines. But the answer here is also found on the next slide. So we're going to move forward to that slide. And this talks about outcomes, the final disposition of our data requests for the first quarter in 2021. Again, we're showing the same categories from the previous slides with the same trend line here. The blue and light green bars are reflective of those requests that are either complete or partial in terms of our release. From the prior slide, we just talked about camera data requests, either being very short in terms of releasing or very long wait times. There isn't a lot of middle ground on that. And as you can see here, camera data requests tend to be those that have no data. I mentioned this earlier, it's either because our cameras, those cameras in the area are not ours, they're not city cameras, therefore it's not city data, or the camera wasn't fixed in a way that it was able to pick up an accident and provide responsive data, or the data no longer exists because it's been destroyed under retention schedules that match state law. So we would have to say no data exists. But when we look at the combination of type, time to close, and the outcomes shown on this slide, we can identify really where we need to focus our efforts for future improvement. As already indicated, the greatest opportunity I think we have here is by increasing our workflows, those defined workflows, so that we can leverage technology more. Before I close, I want to offer just a short trip back in time. I came to the city in 2010, so it's about a decade. In 2010, our individual data requests were actually captured on yellow Post-it notes. And they were posted on a wall upstairs in the mezzanine level of the clerk's office. And as data responses were filled out, additional notes were added to those yellow Post-it notes. All requests were tracked manually. In 2012, we moved from the Post-it note method to tracking requests in a single Excel spreadsheet. And at that time, we had one full-time position to manage all data practices requests for the entire city enterprise. So of course, there wasn't the same volume of requests at that time as there are today, nor was there this general awareness in the community or the savviness about using the Government Data Practices Act to get at government data. So the number of requests over that 10-year period that I've been here have boomed. The type and the complexity of the requests received continues to increase month by month. And so we're left struggling to keep up. I think the majority of folks believe that Minneapolis, being the largest municipality in the state, has access to some state-of-the-art technologies that should make it capable for us to expedite responses in a matter of days, if not hours. I have peers from other jurisdictions, both in Minnesota and across the nation, who routinely call me to say, well, what systems or tools are you using? And we are, all of us that are in this work, challenged to respond to increases in data requests and the use of what are known nationally as sunshine laws across the nation to ensure that government data access is provided. The simple truth is that government is behind the curve here. And even at the federal level, report cards show agency performance routinely is poor. Even our industry is not at a point where it's ready to support government information requests. Our team has evaluated multiple systems that are on the marketplace, and all of them fall short of the desired, in fact, not desired, needed functionality and operating needs that we have. So the vendor community is also struggling to keep up. The systems and tools and the automated workflows that I've described for you today, as well as our ability to provide an online request portal for the public, even our ability to track our own performance and these metrics that we've shown you here today, all of that's been cobbled together by my team in the clerk's office and our IT department. We are still evolving, and we will continue to do that. But the good news here I wanted to share is that we've moved past Post-it notes. We've moved past an Excel spreadsheet. The way we've moved this work forward over just a 10-year period is, in my opinion, pretty incredible. And that the city can consider some meaningful performance metrics to share with policymakers and the public, I think is impressive. I think the city's done a good job, in my opinion, in investing in that work. More is needed, obviously. But I would like to also express my appreciation here for the strong support we've had from this council, not just in terms of data practices, but on the larger issues. Councilmember Fletcher, in terms of data privacy. We've also talked about transparency, information governance, with a whole new ordinance brought forward to the code by Councilmember Palmisano. All of that ensures the public's right to know is protected so that they can hold government accountable for the things that we're doing. And those are critical components of a fair, democratic system of government. So in closing, the story here about data practices is a nuanced one. I know it's been a very long one this morning, and I apologize. It's been a year since we've talked about this. We do want to bring forward these quarterly reports and probably just receive and file them without as much level setting that I've done today. We continue to work in terms of making data more proactively available through our READY applications, and also continue to focus on making data requestable and reusable. I don't know that you would say the numbers show the first quarter of this year was good, sufficient, or acceptable. Time will tell, but I think the total story in sum shows that the city enterprise has done a very good job at making access to government data a priority, and that we continue to reflect and learn from our experiences and grow. So with that, Mr. Chair, I've concluded my comments. I'm happy to respond to any questions there might be from the committee.
We've got at least one question, and before we jump into it, I just want to thank you and your team, and say that, you know, I think that all of us have really appreciated the way in which the clerk's office has leaned into these kinds of requests, to be transparent and to give our community members, our constituents, what they need in terms of transparency. And you continue to improve, and I think that folks, council members, I hope recognize that. I certainly do. And any improvement that we can do, I think really it's going to be a team effort. It's going to require the enterprise, the institution supporting you all. Any room for improvement is I'm convinced not due to a lack of industriousness on the part of your staff. Your staff are incredible, and I just want to be able to say that. So
thank you. Thank you.
With that, I will turn it over to Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll add my thanks to you, Mr. Clerk, and to your staff. I think that there is remarkable progress here, and I think that the very intentional and deliberate kind of display of our metrics, including the places that our responses are very quick and that our responses are very slow, I think is very helpful to give everybody a very complete picture of how things are going. I think that when we present it in this way, it looks very sort of reasonable and rational and measured. I know that at the same time, sometimes we hear about these things, the ones that are in the red, sometimes are creating some actual liability for us as a city and are prompting a lot of anger and frustration from journalists and from people who are trying to get this information to create transparency for our government. So we need to continue to try to improve. I think we've done a lot to really establish it as a value of our city that we want to be very transparent about data, and I really appreciate especially the ways that we've created dashboards so that we don't even have to go through this process to get access to a lot of city data now, which is great. But I think the thing that I'm most aware of and that I think we've probably heard the most feedback on is around data relating to policing. Obviously, we made a structural change to move that work to your office and to clarify responsibility for that work. And I wanted to get just a little bit more of your take on how that's going. Do you have a sense that that's creating some improvement? Are we running into process snags? Is there, what lessons have we learned so far from implementing that shift of resources and shift of responsibility?
Thank you, Councilmember Fletcher, for that. And through the chair, I'll say that we are continuing to work very closely with our colleagues in the police department to help them to become more open and accessible to the public. And I would say that they are doing everything they can to give us the support and information that we need to help them in that process. 2 positions were transferred to our office, and so we were able to fill one of those. The other came with an individual in that position. That immediately has added to our staff team capacity. But again, as I mentioned in my comments, a significant volume of backlogged requests came with it. And so we're working through that. I would say the police department is unique amongst the city in that the volume of requests they receive can at times, based on how data is classified, often exceed the rest of the enterprise combined. And so it's a very tough challenge for us to address. But one of the things that they've been helpful on is working on what I'll call both sides of the stream. On one end of the stream, we're really focusing on data practices. And so this is where data is either being requested or needs to be released right now because it should be and is classified by the law public. We have a team that's working very hard to address this end of the spectrum, which I'll call downstream. Data has already been created. It's a matter of, is it public and can we release it? Where we need to also partner with police and where we've really started working with them has nothing to do with data practices, but ultimately will have the biggest impact on our ability to affect data practices. And that's by going upstream when data is created by all of the hundreds of police officers within the PD department. And that is working with our records management team, which is another division in the IG unit in the clerk's office, to really help the officers across all divisions in MPD understand how data is created, the responsibility they have for the creation of that data, how that data should be stored, who should have access to that data, how long it must be maintained. And so our records management team is already engaging across all of those units in MPD to start that educational process. And also we're undergoing a process of revising and modernizing all of their retention schedules. So retention schedules, of course, are sound very antiquated and it's not a very sexy topic. But the retention schedules required by state law are what define how long we have to keep data. And the last time we did those retention schedules was prior to my time coming to the city. That was in 2010. So that's quite old. And so we're working with them to revise and update and modernize their retention schedules. We're working with them to understand what data needs to be kept, how it should be kept, how we need to make sure that public data is kept separate from private data to the extent practical with the systems that we have, all of which will improve our timelines downstream when it comes to making data either readily accessible via online portals or available through the request process, and hopefully in a much reduced timeline compared to where we are today. So I know that was a long-winded answer, Councilmember Fletcher, but it's a both and. It's yes, we're working with them right now on the current situation with the best abilities and tools we have, and we are also partnering for future improvements by trying to get upstream of the problem and dealing with it there.
Thank you.
Well, I'm not seeing any further questions. Just in, Council President Bender has a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I did also just want to highlight so much the value of this upstream work to make data more accessible and transparent and available in real time. I think members of the public would be shocked at how hard it is for council members to get information when we're weighing important policy decisions. And I think a lot of that comes down to how the data is collected and stored and its availability. Well, at least I hope that's why. I'll give staff the benefit of the doubt and assume that's why. And so when we have data portals available to the public, I think it's such a powerful way to create transparency so that anyone can access the information they may be looking for. But it's also a way to make sure that our policy decisions are informed by data. And so as we continue to build out those types of data that are available in real time over time, I think our policy decisions will just become more and more informed and more rooted in what our community is experiencing, as shown through data. Of course, there are other ways to understand. But as one example is in the housing policy work we're doing, we have significantly more data on our rental market now than we did when I took office. Transportation, we have significantly more data about how people are getting around our city. That includes all modes of transportation. We have significantly more information about stormwater management and potential impacts of climate change on flooding. We have so much, I think, really invested some time and resources in data collection in so many ways that can very powerfully inform decisions, and even better if it's available to any person in the city who wants to get involved in shaping those decisions. So thanks to the clerk and all, the IT staff and lots of folks in departments throughout the city who are really working to operationalize and institutionalize that value that we have transparent data readily available to the public and to thinkers as we make decisions.
Thank you, President Bender. I think with that, I'm not seeing any other questions or comments from my colleagues. And so seeing no further discussion, I will direct the next, we will receive reports from the standing committees on matters to be considered by the full council this Friday. We will begin with Business Inspections, Housing and Zoning Committee, which is chaired by Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Trying to figure out if okay, I think this is working. We'll be bringing 19 items forward for approval tomorrow. Item number 1 is the occupancy regulations ordinance that Council President Bender has been working on for her entire career. And it is finally coming forward, and it was unanimously supported by the committee. This is essentially saying we're not going to define family for you, it moves to the building code as a way to determine occupancy. Item 2 are some changes to our administrative hearing procedures. Item 3 are changes to our animal licensing procedures, including making some changes to our lifetime license and rabies procedures. Item 14 is the Border Avenue Extension redevelopment plan right on the border of the 5th and 7th Ward. Item 5 is Baldwin Square. This is approving it to be in a redevelopment district. Item 6 are appointments to the Zoning Board of Adjustment. Item 7 is a variance appeal that has been withdrawn. So I do want to note I will formally move to withdraw that appeal. Item 8 are the liquor license renewals. You'll note there's just one. Next cycle there are 60. Item number 9 are business license operating conditions so that Storm King Brew Pub and Barbecue can get open. Item 10 is a contract amendment for yard services, and 11 is a contract amendment for yard maintenance services as well. 12 is a local historic district designation, the Mary Lokren Student Rooming House Historic District. Item 13 is the Minnesota Historic Society's Cultural Heritage Grant for a local designation study of 4501 Hiawatha. Item number 14 is authorization to use state bond funds for Norway House. Item 15 is appropriating home and NSP program income. Item number 16 is the spring grant application to the Met Council's Livable Communities program and the demonstration account for transit-oriented development. Item 17 is a Great Streets Gap financing loan for Juxtaposition Arts campus expansion. Item number 18 is just resubordinating and a mortgage refinance for Broadway Flats, a portable housing project. Item 19 is the McPhail Center for Music's annual report. Item 19 is the Arts Commission appointments. Item 21 is a rezoning at 3840 Minnehaha. Item 22 is a rezoning at 2855 Chicago. And item number 3 is approving the much discussed George Floyd Square 38th and Chicago forgivable loan program. With that, I'm happy to answer questions about items 1 through 23.
Seeing no questions, we'll move on to the Policy and Government Oversight Committee chaired by Councilmember Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Ellison, and the Policy and Government Oversight Committee will be bringing forward 31 items. Item number 1 relates to a rollover of unspent 2020 appropriations. Item number 2 is various appointments to the Capital Long Range Improvements Committee. Items 3 through 17 are various legal settlements, including several workers' compensation claims. And items 18 through 31 are various contract amendments, mostly related to the Public Service Building Project. And I will stand for questions.
Thank you, Vice President Jenkins. Seeing no questions, we will go to the Public Health and Safety Committee chaired by Councilmember Cunningham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Public Health and Safety Committee is bringing forward 4 items for approval tomorrow. The first is authorizing a revenue contract with SMG in the amount of $513,600 for bomb detection security services at the US Bank Stadium for large-scale events. So actually all 4 of these items are revenue contracts. The second one is with US Bank Stadium for SWAT security services. The third is providing law enforcement equipment at US Bank Stadium. And the fourth is with the Downtown Improvement District for buyback funds in support of the Minneapolis Downtown Improvement District Summer Police and Police Reserve Program. So those are what we've got for the Public Health and Safety Committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Cunningham. I don't see any questions for you, so we'll move on to the Transportation and Public Works Committee, chaired by Councilmember Reich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The committee will be forwarding 8 items for full council considerations. Item 1 is the 42nd Street East reconstruction project, a series of actions to support that. 2 is the agreement with the City of New Brighton to back up supply water for wholesale water purchase. 3 is the agreement with Hennepin County for Penn Avenue North Street Reconstruction Project. 4 is the Franklin West Reconstruction Project layout approval. 5 is the Special Service Districts, the 2020 annual reports and year-end budget procedures. 6 is the Minnesota Green Corps program application to host Green Corps members for the 2021 and 2022 program year. 7 is the bid for the Grand Avenue South Street Reconstruction Project. 8 is the bid for the Plymouth Avenue North Reconstruction Project. Mr. Chair, I will stand for questions.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Reich. I see no questions for you, and so with that, we've concluded all business to come before the committee today, and hearing no objection. Oh, Council President Bender has a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a couple quick things. So I mentioned this yesterday, but there was a press conference today while we were having this meeting. And then I also mentioned this yesterday, but we've added an agenda item tomorrow to have a presentation at council about the emergency declaration that was in place earlier this week. I did also want to note, as we had the item related to 38th and Chicago come through the Biz Committee, there had been some back and forth about the city council's role in decision making related to the 38th and Chicago. As we've seen, we've had some receive and file reports about the infrastructure decision, budgetary decisions coming through the council. It has been my understanding, and I've asked city attorney, mayor, anyone to clarify if they think differently, but that the mayor and department heads have the authority to make changes at the intersection related to any urgent safety considerations or needs. I've requested that if anyone, city council members, mayor, wants to bring something through the city council related to decisions and the infrastructure of that intersection, especially as the trial here is winding up, that they let the staff know, they write the RCA that would be required to bring a decision through the council process. If there isn't any kind of decision, I suggested that perhaps we would have a presentation from staff at the next of these CAL meetings, just to receive and file so that council and an update about those plans. And I say all that to say, I think we are all understanding and very compassionate about how hard it has been on our colleagues to manage all of the different needs at this intersection, and just commend them for all they are doing. And also the city council makes decisions through our legislative process, and we just need to do a little bit of planning to make sure that when we have decisions that need to come to council, that all the pieces are in place so that council members have time to get the information, so that the clerk's office has time to post things on the LIM system, things have time to make it on the agendas. So that is what I know right now about the status of any decisions about 30th and Chicago as it pertains to the city council making decisions. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Council President. I will, and with that, I think we have concluded all of our business for today, and I will declare this meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.